Amnesia is one of the most overused tropes in storytelling. The main character wakes up, doesn't remember a single thing about who he is and what he does in his life, and then he's getting introduced into the world by other characters, very conveniently introducing the reader or viewer into the story as well. Convenience is important here. Amnesia is often used as a cheap way to overcome one of the biggest problems of storytelling. How do you let the reader or viewer know what is happening in the story without running into major plot holes or ridiculous as-you-know type of dialogue from other characters? The amnesia trope helps avoid that. Because the main character doesn't know anything about the fictional world they appear in, we get to figure it out together with the character, and thus our knowledge is basically the same as theirs. It does raise the question though, does amnesia as a trope really make stories better in any way, given the sheer amount of times this trope has been used in almost any type of media? It seems like lately it indeed has been seen as kind of a lazy way of introducing plot information, while not giving the slightest regard for what amnesia is and how it functions in real-life medical cases. Reviews of amnesia as a trope would often resort to comparing it to descriptions of amnesia from medical books and end up discarding the whole thing as having no consideration for the real world. And while I would agree that it might come off as sloppy writing, as it often does, I wouldn't agree that's all there is to it. Instead, in my video I'd like to propose a slightly deeper analysis of what amnesia does in narratological and not medical terms, and also some of the philosophical implications we might derive from a few of those works that use amnesia as a plot device. I am mainly going to focus on analyzing video games because I think it is in video games that the trope is getting its full potential, but I'm also going to talk a lot about literature, literary theory, and philosophy to support my claims. As for the games, I'm going to focus on analyzing two of them, Disco Elysium and Planescape Torment, which in my opinion are exemplary uses of this trope. However, I don't expect you to have any familiarity with those games, as I'll try to introduce them on the go without spoilers and draw conclusions that could be employed when talking about the amnesia trope regardless of the medium where it's used. But first things first, why video games? Video games are, unlike any other medium, inextricably bound to you as the player. If with books, films, theater, etc., it is possible to assume the role of the passive observer of the work of art and not get involved, with video games that's impossible by definition. You do have to take certain actions and shape the content of the game at your will, as otherwise you wouldn't be able to progress. I like the metaphor that the Polish scholar Tomasz Gnat proposes for video gaming. It's the metaphor of Narcissus from Caravaggio's painting of the same name. Unlike in other kinds of media where you can sit back and observe what is happening on the stage, screen, or page, with video games you have to lean towards the display, almost reach into it, seeing a reflection of yourself in that display. The possibility to customize your character and control their decisions is what allows you to develop a personal attachment to the character. The character almost becomes a creation of your own. Gnat says, the modern Narcissus is not only gazing into the surface of the pond, but he is able to shape the image to his liking, use the reflection not only as a reality check, but as a method of expression and of the articulation of conscious and unconscious desires. The idea of a reality check is important here. While video games are often seen as one of the most escapist artistic media, they nonetheless aim to make a very personal connection to the very real player, along with their fears, problems, dreams, etc. If we come back to the topic of amnesia, then this trope only amplifies that effect inherent to all video games. When we start a game for the first time as an amnesia character, our knowledge of the world inside the game is essentially equal to the knowledge of the character himself, and so we get to explore the world of the game step by step together with the character, uncovering new information along with them. But that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is how the amnesia trope challenges the very notion of human identity. One of the best examples of that I've seen is the 1999 video game Planescape Torment, which is about a character known as the Nameless One who wakes up in some sort of morgue and, surprise surprise, doesn't remember a damn thing about his past. It turns out the Nameless One is immortal. The price for that immortality is that each time he dies, he loses his memory. He walks around the magical city of Sigil looking for some traces of his past lives, and finds out that in those past lives he caused quite some trouble. One of the game's features is the so-called sensory stones that hold memories of other people and allow you to rewatch those memories. In one of those memories you can see yourself from one of your past lives, and grasping that creates many difficulties for the protagonist. He's not sure whether he should refer to that man in the first or third person, since it's at the same time he and not he. He's told, "It is you, but not you. You feel yourself being torn." Disco Elysium, which is a game about a detective solving a murder mystery, takes this one step further. In the protagonist Harry's dream after day one, he finds his own body hanging from a tree in exactly the same spot where the victim had been hung. Similarly to Planescape, this feels both as Harry and not Harry. It's as if Harry's past self had been hung on that tree. In both of these games, the encounter with your pre-amnesiac self is represented as an encounter with a paradoxical other that undermines your very perception of yourself. The implication of this splitting of the subject is very profound. It undermines the very idea of the human being that existed at least since the times of Renaissance. Traditionally, the human being is seen as the bearer of a certain intrinsic self, of an autonomous ego that drives their actions and defines the totality of their existence. The way the amnesia trope undermines that certainty in human identity is very similar to some of the core ideas of the 20th century philosophy. In particular, psychoanalysis posits that the idea of a stable and autonomous self is false, since there are forces that control our lives yet reside outside our conscious selves. Specifically, those forces are the unconscious and language, which in the view of Jacques Lacan are deeply connected. Sherry Turkle, in her review of Lacan's books, says that this is a way of thinking that has no room for notions of objective reality or autonomous ego. The heart of the subject there isn't autonomy, but submission to language, or in the optical metaphors of the seminar, at the heart of the subject there isn't a self, but a mirror reflecting a mirror. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of Lacan's psychoanalysis, as that would require at least some 10 hours of brain twisting, but you can already see the similarity between Lacan and many of the works that use the amnesia trope. The protagonist is a deeply problematic subject that in no way controls his life, but instead is controlled by a past life he is no longer conscious of. And taking into account what I mentioned regarding the nature of video games, like it or not, we get to feel the same things. We ourselves start to doubt the nature of our own identity. We might be certain of what our lives consist of, but in the end, there might be something that escapes our knowledge and yet exerts a crucial influence over our lives. Disco Elysium lets us know that this is exactly the focus of the whole game by starting it with a quote from a poem by Ronald Stuart Thomas called Reflections. The quote goes, "The Furies are at home in the mirror, it is their address, even the clearest water, if deep enough, can drown." Now, the mention of the mirror is very significant. It is a classic metaphor for self-identification, which in this case gains a certain otherworldly, sinister meaning. The mirror is the place where the Furies reside, where they catch you right at the moment of attempting self-identification through the mirror. The mirror is a dangerous locus. It is perhaps even better to stay away from it. The poem ends with the words, "Silent communion where gaspingly you partake of a shifting identity, never your own." Here Thomas is again very much in line with what was spoken about before. Identity, he seems to be saying, is never a static or autonomous feature of the human being. Instead, it shifts without our knowing, and any attempt at fixing it in place, trying to define it through a mirror, is just one way of symbolically dying at the hands of the Furies. This is essentially what happens in Disco Elysium. In the room you wake up, you get the chance to look in the mirror, which is presented as a rather traumatizing experience, even if you pick one of those goofy dialogue options. We're told that it appears that the protagonist is dead, and if not dead, wears a certain expression that makes you wish he were dead. As we find out later, it's the signature expression of Guillaume Le Millon, who used to be a superstar of disco music, but died 20 years ago, setting off a slow decline of that whole musical culture. So remembering and identifying yourself is presented as a rather traumatizing experience, which is best to be avoided. We'll come back to that topic a bit later. But coming back to Thomas's poem, the reference to Furies here is also not accidental. The Furies, or Erinyes, are creatures from ancient Greek mythology, and ancient Greek mythology and literature is something that obviously inspired both Disco Elysium and Planescape Torment. The central feeling of these games, the feeling of identity slipping out of your own hands, is the same kind of feeling as the one created by the ancient Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex, which is about a king who, at an old age, finds out that many years ago he unknowingly married his own mother and killed his father. And not only is it important for psychoanalysis since it forms the basis of the concept of the Oedipus complex, but it also seems to be an important reference for Planescape Torment. In one of the episodes where the Nameless One is tasked with retrieving a magical sword from a god Cassius, and Cassius tells us that he will only give us the sword if we provide a correct answer to 3 questions. And the first of those questions is exactly the question that the Sphinx asks Oedipus: what walks on 4 legs at dawn, 2 legs at noon, and 3 at dusk? The answer is, of course, a human being. I find that Planescape Torment addresses the exact same kind of fear as Oedipus Rex, the fear that we might have committed something bad in our past without actually being conscious of doing it, the fear that our life might be something completely different from what we imagine it to be. It is this very fear that has been a distinct feature of the ancient Greek tragedy. Aristotle in his Poetics says the following: "Tragedy is a representation of an action of a superior kind, effecting through pity and fear the purification of such emotions." Though his idea of purification or catharsis is quite obscure, it is often interpreted as a process of experiencing a very negative emotion, quite possibly resembling something that might happen in your own life, and by doing it, feeling a certain kind of enlightenment. The emotion is, according to Aristotle, evoked by the techniques of reversal and discovery, when the course of events changes its direction completely, and when there occurs a change from ignorance to knowledge. It is these very features that have given an enormous power to literature since the dawn of time that make the Amnesia Trope shine very brightly if executed with due creativity. In its best form, the Amnesia Trope does make use of reversing courses of action precisely because of going from ignorance to knowledge. In a way, movement from ignorance to knowledge is what the trope is essentially about, and by performing that movement we do feel a certain purification, since, as I've already discussed before, by talking about some made-up characters, those games are essentially talking about us as the players that share the same emotions and fears as the characters. So in a way, the Amnesia Trope takes advantage of features that have existed in literature for many, many centuries and continue to work and excite us even today. One other important feature of the Amnesia Trope is its preoccupation with the name of the protagonist. For instance, in the 2007 game Stalker, the whole game revolves around finding out the person behind the name written in the protagonist's personal computer. Not gonna spoiler it, but the discovery of who that is quite shocking. It has to do with the name of the protagonist himself. In many of those Amnesia games, the search for the protagonist's true name is shown as a very problematic process, as if the protagonist doesn't quite want to know the name or shouldn't know it. In Planescape, we get to talk to a character who says, "A true name's a dangerous thing, gives others power. Keep your name secret, keep it close, never let it out." Later on, it is suggested by one of your past incarnations that you fear names. Names have power and identity. Others can use names as weapons. Names are a hook that can be used to track you across the planes. Remain nameless, and you shall be safe. And that's exactly what the protagonist, literally named the Nameless One, does. He only gets to find out his real name by the very end of the game, and even that he finds out in secret from the very player. He gets to give a fake name, something like Adan, here and there, but his true name remains secret throughout the game. Something similar happens in Disco Elysium. The game allows you to play the gift ball and pretend you're not actually Harry Dubois, but someone named Raphael Ambrosius Costo. You can even gain a thought that you are, in fact, Detective Costo, and after completing it, you get to introduce yourself as Costo, even though you've been told numerous times that you're actually Harry Dubois. Is that some kind of delusion? Yes and no. It's a no because the character we're playing as is no longer the same old Harry Dubois. It might be even wrong to go on calling him by that name, since this is now quite a different person. After all, as we are told, Detective Costo specializes in ancient things and art, not in getting drunk and breaking windows with his shoes. In both cases, the name of the character before the amnesia is shown as something oppressive, and that probably has to do with the very nature of proper names. According to John Searle, a proper name doesn't just refer to an object in the world, it refers to an object imbued with a set of characteristics about that object. He gives an example, the name Aristotle. He says that when we refer to Aristotle, we don't just refer to the actual person that existed in the world, we also refer to a cluster of characteristics about him. For example, with Aristotle, the characteristics might be the ancient Greek philosopher, author of Poetics, student of Plato, etc. And then if it so happens that a majority of those characteristics come to be untrue regarding that person, then the very reference to Aristotle would lose its sense, because it is those characteristics that we are more interested in, not the existence of the person devoid of the characteristics. Now, this is quite relevant for our discussion of the amnesia trope. The pre-amnesiac name of the protagonist is definitely closely connected to all the characteristics of the protagonist from that period of his life. If that period is a traumatic one, as is often the case, then the name becomes an unwanted attribute of the protagonist's identity, something to be avoided at all costs. So when Harry Dubois chooses for himself the identity of Raphael Ambrosius Costo, we shouldn't perceive it just as a joke. The new identity is an attempt to escape the oppressive past with all the characteristics associated with it. So if Harry Dubois gets to keep the old characteristics of a drunkard cop who solved 216 cases and killed 3 people, Raphael Ambrosius Costo gets a chance to become a specialist in ancient things and art, even despite the fact that this is biologically the same person. So on the one hand, the amnesia gives a chance to start anew without the burden and trouble of the past, but also highlights how hard it is actually to get away from it. A quote from Planescape sums it up perfectly. At what point am I allowed to be me without the weight of those past lives? It seems that that point never finally arrives in any of those games, despite the attempts of the protagonists to break away from the past. Another interesting aspect of the amnesia trope is the way memory and remembrance work in those amnesiac stories. Memory here is represented as something very close to the experience of trauma. According to Cathy Caruth, trauma is characterized by a deferral of experience, where the traumatic reality only gets experienced with a certain delay in time. She writes, "The experience of trauma, the fact of latency, would thus seem to consist not in the forgetting of a reality that can hence never be fully known, but in inherent latency within the experience itself. The historical power of the trauma is not just that the experience is repeated after its forgetting, but it is only in and through its inherent forgetting that it is first experienced at all." So forgetting seems to be a necessary part of the experience of trauma, since it is only by forgetting that you can fully grasp what happened during the traumatic event. Now, if we look at the amnesia trope, then we'll see how much the questions of trauma and memory are interlinked in the trope. Amnesia itself is very often a result of some traumatic experience that initially gets repressed and only becomes fully known later on as you are playing the game. For instance, in Disco Elysium, amnesia happens as a result of a blackout from getting drunk, which itself was likely caused by Harry's breakup with his fiancée. Something very similar happens in Planescape Torment. In this game, amnesia is an integral part of dying, which is no doubt a very traumatic experience, I can imagine. All of those traumatic experiences only become manifest later on, and thus they are deferred in time in terms of their perception by the main character, which also seems to be the only way to truly know what happened, as the knowing requires a certain distance which you don't have in the middle of things. However, what's interesting is that experience is not only deferred in time, but also in space. In amnesiac stories, experience and memory are often externalized. They reside someplace else outside the mind of the amnesiac protagonist, that is, in other people, and most interestingly, in inanimate objects. In Disco Elysium, for example, there's this motor carriage that froze to the shore, and when you try to inspect it, you realize it's the motor carriage that belongs to Harry himself. He just went wild, apparently, and drove it right into the ocean. For him, it's one of those traces from the night when he suffered amnesia. What I think explains the allure of such episodes is Pierre Nora's distinction between history and memory. For Nora, memory is lived experience, something private, subjective, often involuntary, and often unself-conscious. History, on the other hand, is a representation of the things that happened. It tries to rise above the individual memories and work with facts, with traces, with concrete evidence. And not only does it work on the collective level with history per se as an academic discipline, but on a personal level as well. By writing journals, memoirs, creating family trees and archives, we all participate in the creation of personal histories. Nora says, "The imperative of our age is not only to keep everything, to preserve every indicator of memory, even when we are not sure which memory is being indicated, but also to produce archives." So the matter of recording is crucial here. And although Nora is mainly talking about the real world, not fiction, I feel like his distinction is also relevant when discussing how private memory works in amnesiac stories. In these stories, we can see very clearly how memory is gradually being replaced by history, how events that used to be lived experience are now reconstructed by the detective who lost his memory and tries to make a chronicle of the things that happened to make a clear idea of the chronology of events. This is, I think, what makes the amnesia trope so interesting in narratological terms. What we see in those stories is not lived experience, but experience reconstructed. The process of playing turns into something similar to archaeological excavation, where we have to uncover and reconstruct the events that have happened based on the remnants of those events. The story becomes way more complicated, but also way more rewarding. Instead of getting a first-hand chronological account of the things that happened, we get to recollect the story piece by piece, but we also get to witness how unreliable the process of writing history is. In Disco Elysium, for example, every person you meet seems to have a different opinion on your pre-amnesiac self, and that's how we know that any singular account made up of those opinions is never going to be as objective as history pretends to be. The preoccupation with memory and history is as important in Planescape Torment. In this game, the protagonist writes his own personal journal of the events that happen throughout the game. Not only is it a pure convenience for the player that allows you to reread what has happened, but it is also a significant manifestation of how history replaces memory. It seems like the only way the protagonist is able to live through a certain experience is by turning it into history on the pages of his journal, which makes sense, since memory is unreliable, especially when you lose it every time you die. But history here is no better. Even though he does try to facilitate his understanding of the world by keeping a written record, sometimes the record betrays him. One such case happens when the Nameless One gets into a sensory stone of some past incarnation of his, but it turns out that the whole thing is a trap created by his past incarnation because he doesn't want to share his own life with somebody else. It seems like Planescape Torment is fully aware of the dangers that lie within mapping memory into history. History is deceptive, it says, and there's nothing we can do about it. So what I see in these games is very high potential for exploring extremely difficult questions of identity, memory, and history, and if the game does try to integrate those reflections into its core, like it happens with Disco Elysium and Planescape Torment, then what we get is a very philosophically mature work of art that is going to be discussed for many, many generations. Thank you for listening.